If you've ever looked up in the sky and seen something up there you could not explain, there is a very good chance our guest tonight may have heard about it. Stanton Friedman was a respected nuclear physicist for a number of top-notch companies, including General Electric and Westinghouse, when his career took a fascinating turn. In 1970, he gave up the corporate world to dedicate himself to the scientific investigation of unidentified flying objects. He has been a respected voice in the field of UFOs ever since then, giving talks and lectures around the world, publishing scholarly papers and books. In other words, in the world of UFOlogy, experts don't get any bigger than Stanton Friedman, and after a long career, he's decided to retire this year. We are very happy to welcome Stanton Friedman to our studios in Fredericton tonight. Thanks so much for joining us, Stanton.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
You've already worked, by my calculations, about 20 years past pension age. Why have you decided to retire now?
Well, I gave my first lecture 50 years ago, and frankly, I'm tired. I'm getting old, traveling around. I've lectured in all 50 states, 10 provinces, 19 other countries. I've seen the world, be a ufologist, see the world.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm tired.
Tired.
It's time.
Time to have a rest. Were you interested in UFOs even when you were a kid, when you were a boy? Is this something that's always interested you?
No. I read my first book when I was 22, I think, 23.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, I was working on nuclear airplanes, pretty far out stuff. And then I worked on fission rockets and fusion rockets and things like that. So it sort of goes with the territory of what's going on. And I worked under security for 14 years. And so I've been to 20 archives. I have an unusual background, but the security and the high tech, worked on fission nuclear rockets this big, power level 1,000 megawatts, half the power of Grand Coulee Dam, you know, like this.
Incredible.
So the technology fascinated me, and then I found I enjoyed speaking, enjoyed traveling, and I found that people were curious. I always get plenty of questions. I've only had 11 hecklers and over 700 lectures. I've written 6 books. My time has come.
Yeah. I'd say you've earned a rest for sure. I read today that you prefer the term flying saucer over UFO. Is that right? And why is that?
Well, yeah, I do, because UFOs covers all kinds of stuff, and I come on very strong. I'm not saying UFOs are real. I'm saying flying saucers are real.
Yeah.
Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. There's a cosmic Watergate. We're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. And there are no good objections to that. So I come on strong. I'm talking about flying saucers, alien spacecraft zipping around in the atmosphere of our planet. I'm not saying I know where they come from or why they're here, or why they don't talk to me. That's a different question.
Governments rarely admit that this is going on. They never admit that this is going on.
Well, some of the best data is government data, but you'd never know about it from them.
Right. So
one of the biggest studies ever done, the thing that got me hooked on flying saucers, Project Blue Book Special Report 14.
Right.
Covers 3,201 sightings. Work was done under Air Force contract by Battelle Memorial Institute. They put out a totally misleading, dare I say, lying press release. They said even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions.
So why
if more complete observational data had been available.
Why do governments...
Well, the fact of the matter is the unknowns are 21.5%, not 3%. And they were completely separate from the ones listed as not enough data. They said, on the basis of this study, we believe no objects such as those properly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions. They lied, and I don't like being lied to.
Probably
working under security, you learn to be careful, tread carefully, and so forth. but flat out lying, I disapprove.
Probably
So
the
I spent
most.
the last 50 years proving that the government was lying.
I want to talk to you about Roswell, because that was probably the most famous case that you were involved in and continue to be involved in, because you're going back again this summer, aren't you?
I'm the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident.
Right.
Just by accident, I was talking to somebody else about a sighting he'd had back in 1970, in the mid-70s. And he told me about a sighting his mother had had. I talked to his mother. She was working at a radio station in Albuquerque. Their affiliate in Roswell had a report out that a saucer had crashed and it was being sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Yeah. And she was told to put it on the wire to the reporter in Roswell, put it on the wire, on the phone to Albuquerque, because they didn't have, in Roswell, they didn't have a connection to the wire. She started to do that, and the transmission was interrupted. Do not continue this transmission. What should I do? She says, I'm totally surprised. Stop talking. And so the story went out. It made headlines for 3 hours. Army captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. 3 hours later, sorry, it was just a weather balloon. But it wasn't just a weather balloon.
Want to ask
and
you
I spent
about
an awful lot of time since that 1970s encounter.
Sure.
Talking to witnesses. The first person I talked to was the intelligence officer at the Roswell Army Airfield, which was unique. It was the most elite military group in the United States. They had dropped the bombs, the atomic bombs, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 more in Operation Crossroads. Nobody else had access to nuclear weapons. The man I talked to was the intelligence officer, Major Jesse Marcel. I've since talked to more than 60 other witnesses. Other people have gotten into the act. There's no question that a saucer crash was recovered with bodies, and we were lied to.
I wanted to ask you about Shag Harbor around here. Are you convinced an object crashed in Shag Harbor in October of 1967?
Oh, Shag Harbor,
Yeah.
yes. I've been down to Shag Harbor.
Right.
And it's a good case. There were a lot of witnesses, and the RCMP was on the scene because they thought it was a plane crash right away. And the witnesses were young. I've talked to some of the witnesses. I think some are still alive. The Roswell witnesses are all gone, unfortunately. Not surprising.
Do you think we, as a planet, should do more to welcome these aliens if they're coming to visit us anyway? Should we be somehow putting out signals to them to come this way? Or do you worry that maybe they might not be friendly?
Well, I don't think welcoming is quite the word. If the aliens wanted to destroy us, they would have done that a long time ago. If the governments would stop lying about what's going on, and it's not just the United States government or the Canadian government, many other governments have also lied. I guess they perceive it as a threat. I mean, after all, we might be expected to act as if we and all the other governments are part of planet Earth instead of being nationalistically oriented. We're kind of a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. Military budget this year is $1 trillion on planet Earth. Surely there are better things we can do than threaten each other.
Want to ask
there are
you,
plenty of kids.
I just wanted to ask you how you plan to spend your retirement, Stanton.
Well, I might have some fun. Read a lot of books, maybe do a little traveling, see what my wife wants to do instead of my doings taking precedence. You know, I don't know that I'll write another book. I've written 6 already.
Yeah.
But life is still interesting. But it's nice not to have pressures.
Glad to hear it, and thanks so much for joining us tonight. Stanton Friedman, one of the world's foremost experts on flying saucers and a longtime resident of Fredericton. After decades of research, lectures, books, papers, and public appearances, he's slowly calling it a career, and we thank him for joining us tonight.
My name is Stanton Friedman. Was trained as a nuclear physicist, spent 14 years in industry for little companies like General Electric, Westinghouse, General Motors, working on a variety of far-out advanced nuclear and space system development programs. It was great while it lasted, but these were 3 years here, 3 years there, 3 years someplace else. I read a book in 1958, Captain Edward Ruppelt's book about flying saucers. He had been head of Project Blue Book for the Air Force in the early 50s. And the book intrigued me. And I shared it with a neighbor who was 10 years older than I and a good engineer, and he was more impressed than I was, and that impressed me. So I got hooked. It was intriguing. And because I was working on far out things, nuclear rockets, fission rockets, nuclear airplanes, fusion rockets, whatever, the technology aspect particularly seemed intriguing to me because I was working on far out stuff myself. So saucers must be far out too. And the epiphany, a special moment came in the early 1960s when I was at the University of California, Berkeley Library. I had read 10 books about UFOs. And suddenly I was confronted with the largest study ever done for the Air Force, which hadn't been mentioned in any of these books. It was Project Blue Book, Special Report number 14. And I was in data heaven. Charts, tables, graphs, maps, wow. And also, another aspect of this report was that it included the press release that the Air Force issued in 1955 when this study was completed. And I was shocked because there was the Secretary of the Air Force, Donald Quarles, lying through his teeth about the results of the study. I don't like being lied to, especially by somebody at that level. He said, on the basis of this study, we believe that no objects such as those popularly described as flying saucers have overflown the United States. Even the unknown 3% could have been identified as conventional phenomena or illusions if more complete observation data had been available. Well, I had the report. It was a total lie. The unknowns were 21.5%. That's a long way from 3%. And they were completely separate from the 9.3% listed as insufficient information. So it was wrong on both counts. And they had quality evaluation. It turns out the better the quality of the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable, which is what you'd expect if there was something real. And so I became determined to get to the bottom of this. I don't like being lied to. I mean, I worked under security for 14 years, and you sometimes tiptoe around the truth, but not without blatant lying like that. So I joined APRO and NICAP, the big UFO groups, and joined a group of people when I was working for Westinghouse on nuclear rockets. We had a little UFO research institute and stuff. And I gave my first lecture, it was just happened kind of thing. I had read Frank Edwards' book. He had a best-selling book about flying saucers. He was a newsman in Indianapolis, and I'd been living there working for General Motors. And I got a copy of his book, and then I moved to Pittsburgh to work for Westinghouse Astronuclear Lab on nuclear rocket engines. That was exciting. And I called Frank and said, Frank, I want to go public. Give me some names. He knew everybody. He was a journalist who traveled a great deal. And he gave me some names, and one of them was a producer of a radio show at KDKA Pittsburgh, biggest station in Pittsburgh. And one of the persons was the producer of a radio show called Contact, appropriate program. And I called and offered my services, gave him my professional background, and the response was, don't call us, we'll call you. Less than a month later, they called me at 6:30. Could I do their 7 o'clock show, please? Somebody had canceled at the last minute, and I lived near the station. So I said yes, and I did it. And somebody at work at Westinghouse said, Stan, we're reading Frank's book at my book review club. How about giving us a lecture in my living room? That was my first lecture in her living room. And I did the show several times, did more lecturing. And one day, driving to work with a woman who worked at Westinghouse, supervisor, Joanne had a PhD, and we lived downtown, and Westinghouse was out of town, a little town called Large. And I said, gee, I'd like to speak at Caltech.
California Institute, not California Institute of Technology, Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Mellon, major university. And she says, have you talked to the dean? And I said, no, I talked to Dr. So-and-so. Well, Stan, why don't you talk to the dean? He's my husband. He's heard you on the radio. Give him a call. So I gave him a call, and we booked a talk, but it was a daytime talk, so I'd have to take some time off work. His last question was, how much do you want? Well, how about $100, thinking he'd knock me down to 50. He bought the 100, and then he told me what he was paying the other speakers in the series. 1,500, 1,700. Well, the talk went extremely well, and he sent a nice letter to the agent through whom he had booked the other speakers. And they booked me at the Engineering Society of Detroit for $300 in expenses. Wow, I was in the big time. They were sold out for 2 weeks in advance for 1,008 people for dinner and a talk, and there weren't any negative questions. That impressed me. Not the money, but just the fact that Engineering Society of Detroit is a very legitimate organization. And I worked a lot with engineers and scientists in the work that I was doing at Westinghouse and had been doing before that. The fact that they responded so well impressed me. So I gave a bunch more talks, and we had a great success on the nuclear rocket program at Westinghouse. And they canceled the program. Success breeds cancellation, I guess. And I had to find a job. I had a wife and kids and so forth. And so driving across the country, I had located a job at McDonnell Douglas. And my job was the epitome of what I wanted to do, try to figure out how flying saucers worked. That's a technological challenge, you know. How could they go back and forth, up and down, all this sort of stuff. As I'm driving across the country, I hear on the radio that the program that was going to sponsor me was canceled. How'd you like to walk in for taking your new job when they say, you know, we just laid off 5,000 people? Well, that happened. They kept me for 3 months, but I knew I had to take responsibility for myself. Well, since that time, I've given over 700 lectures in all 50 states, 10 provinces, and 19 other countries. It turns out I enjoy giving lectures. I'm at home on the stage. And I used to have a very good memory. That's very important when you get asked questions, when you need an answer now, not tomorrow, now, you know. So here I am, still going strong at my ripe old age. And I bring to the subject a couple of special characteristics. One of them is having worked under security. A lot of people don't understand security. For example, I've done a whole book about Operation Majestic 12, a very controversial organization, which supposedly, if you believe the important stuff, was set up by President Truman to dig into the UFO question. And I'm one of the few people who's saying, yeah, there's 3 genuine documents, there's 36 false ones, I don't care about them. You know, give me the genuine ones. So my familiarity with security, I mean, I have people tell me, oh, the people on that would have told their wives. You never tell your wife anything classified. First of all, it's against the law. You've signed a piece of paper. And second, loose lips sink ships. You know, who knows who's out there, who's nosing around to find out things that you don't want them to know. So security is one thing. Second is the advanced propulsion stuff. I mean, the biggest objection raised by scientific people, supposedly, is you can't get here from there. The SETI community, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, I say it stands for Silly Effort to Investigate, SETI. And they say, well, the nearest civilization would have to be hundreds of light years away. And, well, that simply isn't true. And today, more than ever, we know, thanks to the Kepler satellite, that gee, there are planets all over the place out there. Not just occasionally. The average, it is assumed today, is 1 to 1.6 planets per star. Now, what does that mean? In a local neighborhood, within 100 light years, which is just down the street, the galaxy is 100,000 light years across, so 100 light years next door. there are 10,000 stars. So if there's between 1 and 1.6 planets per star, that means between 10,000 and 16,000 planets within a mere 100 light years. And throughout the galaxy, we're talking billions and billions of planets. So I'm not saying they all have life. They don't have to. You know, we nuclear guys are accustomed to dealing with the smaller part of something that makes a big difference. Uranium is mostly uranium-238. We want uranium-235. 0.7%. Ah, nothing. During World War II, to build the first atomic bomb, we established a facility that was a mile long, and you pump gas through it, uranium gas, uranium hexafluoride gas, and you want to enrich it in uranium-235. It moves a little faster than uranium-238 because it's a little lighter. During the war, we were using 5% of all the electricity produced in the United States just to pump the gas in that facility, in secret, mind you. So it's the 235 that matters, less than 0.7%. But who cares about the other 99.3%? It's 235 you want. So I have a peculiarly jaundiced background. You look for what's important, not the general things. Third, I found out that I was at home on the stage. I could keep my cool under fire. And I found that I enjoyed doing that. And I had a very good memory. This is a long time ago when I got started. But so it made a good combination. I could answer questions now. And I once figured I'd answered 70,000 questions in the course of my life. And also, I've been forced to think about a lot of questions, what I call the why questions. Why would aliens come here? Why doesn't the government tell us what it knows? Questions like that. I know I'm going to get asked about that sort of stuff, so I've got to ponder it. I've been to 20 document archives, some of them many times, presidential library, stuff like that. And getting back to this Majestic 12 business, the debunkers, a typical example was, oh, this document that you think is genuine was typed in the large pica type. But the National Security Council used only elite type, this gentleman said. And I've got 9 documents to prove it, and they're all elite type. He challenged me to provide any other genuine documents done in the same size and style type as this question document. He had never been, I found out, to the Eisenhower Library. I've spent weeks there. And to make a long story short, I, in my next visit there, picked up 14 documents done in the same size and style type, made copies, and sent him an invoice for $1,000. He offered me $100 each for every genuine document, up to a maximum of 10. He had never been to the Eisenhower Library, so this is off the top of his head. And I copied the 14, sent him an invoice for $1,000, and he paid me. And he got very angry when I published a copy of his check in a book. But it's a ridiculous thing that he said without any knowledge behind it. So I enjoy being at archives. My basic rule is have facts in hand before putting mouth in gear, or pen. I've authored or co-authored 6 books. And I think that's an absolute requirement. You can't just say things. You have to have evidence for them. And sometimes you don't have enough evidence, so you don't say it. You may think it's true, and it may be true, but if you don't have the evidence, no way, Jose, that's not what you talk about. So I also have the benefit of people telling me a lot of stuff after my lectures. They are impressed with my background as a nuclear physicist, worked for big companies and so forth. And so I've had a lot of people tell me things, which gives me food for thought, which lets me know what people wonder about, what some people know that would be useful for me to know, things like that. So it's been quite a trip. First lecture in 1967, here I am more than 700 lectures later, all 50 states, 10 provinces, and 19 other countries. That's a pretty good sampling of the world, in other words, from Australia to Finland to Argentina to Korea, China. So I've been really blessed by the opportunity to interact with lots of people, media people, as well as plain audience members, and scientific and professional people. So if you had asked me back in the early 60s if I thought I'd wind up being a full-time ufologist, I'd have laughed my head off. What are you talking about? You know, I worked my way through college. I've got to be a professional physicist. Well, got away from that. And I haven't regretted it, really. So one of the things that's been interesting is trying to look at the planet Earth, our wonderful home, the way aliens would look at it. How do we look to them? And it's not a pretty picture. I mean, let's face it, World War II, we killed 50 million people. I mean, our own kind. These aren't aliens we killed. These are Earthlings. We destroyed 1,700 cities. Even this year, we're spending $1 trillion on things military. We have exploded, this surprises people, 2,000 nuclear weapons. That many? Yes, that many. And, you know, I'm a nuclear guy, but still, I don't like the idea of nuclear weapons and people being threatened. I've got a great-grandson, I've got a grandson. I'm concerned about the people on this planet. And, you know, it's kind of funny. People can't think of reasons for anybody to travel. Well, I can. All four of my grandparents were born in Europe. I grew up in the United States. I was born in the United States. But migration, colonization, they're a big part of what happens on this planet. I mean, Las Vegas, there weren't many people living there 150 years ago, I don't think you'd say. So I found this a fascinating opportunity to find out about something important. For example, I'm the original civilian investigator of the Roswell incident. And it came about because I was lecturing. I was supposed to do 2 lectures at a television station, or 2 interviews at a television station in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, speaking that night at Louisiana State University. And I did the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be found. This is back in 1978. The station manager is talking to me. He's giving me coffee. He's looking at his watch. He knows I have things to do, and so does he. Out of the blue, he says, you know, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. Brilliant investigator that I am. I said, what's special about him? Who's he? His next sentence changed my life. He said, he handled wreckage of one of those saucers you're interested in when he was in the military. What? Where'd that come from? There wasn't anybody around. He wasn't making a joke. He was quite serious. What do you know about him? He lives in Houma. I didn't know where Houma, Louisiana was. I was there later to see Jesse. But anyway, everything went well that day because the reporter showed up finally. The next day, I was at the airport early, and I called information. That's what we use before you use computers to get all your numbers. Got a number for Jesse, called him. He told me his story. And that was the beginning. That was 1978. So that's what, 38 years or 39 years ago. And I've been on the case ever since. But it was a very important case to me and to the world, I think. Because here we have the President of the United States, Harry Truman, establishing a group for the purpose of dealing with flying saucers. Because we'd recovered the wreckage of one near Roswell. And there have been several other wrecks that have been recovered. All this is done in secret. The United States nor any other country is willing to admit that, oh, by the way, aliens are visiting. You know, that's a big story. So I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time. And it turns out Jesse Marcel had never told the television guy anything important. He had seen the article in the New Orleans Times-Picayune newspaper. And back then, you'd put in a military guy's name and where he was from, his hometown. It was standard practice. And when I asked the television guy, what did Jesse tell you? He asked him about it. I can't talk about it. So he hadn't given away anything. And I found out later there were articles in newspapers from Chicago West about the event. Early July 1947. It was a big story, headlines. And then they said, oh, well, just a radar reflector weather balloon combination, and they got rid of it. One big question about UFOs, of course, is, so what? Who cares? So there are aliens zipping around the planet, landing hither and there, yon, picking up specimens, abduction cases, for example. I've co-authored a book with Kathleen Marden, Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. She was Betty Hill's niece. I had met Betty, been at her home, done television programs with her, and Kathy heard about the story the day it happened, when Betty called Kathleen's mother, her sister. And so that was way back in 1961. So she's been in on the story right from the start. And it's an important story because it tells you something about the aliens and about our reaction to them. They picked up a specimen. There was catch and release time, to use a fisherman's term. You know, it's okay to catch the fish, but you got to throw them back. And Betty and Barney were thrown back, kind of thing. But it seems to be that the aliens are here, among other purposes, to pick up specimens and study their physiological structure, so to speak. And that may sound strange to some people. You realize we go out and pick up specimens, animals, for zoos or for other things. What's going on, you know? It strikes me as one of the most important stories of this millennium that the planet's being visited, partly because when you see where we are on the technological scales, the fact that we can build nuclear weapons, enormous nuclear weapons, also means we could build propulsion systems to get us to the stars. And frankly, if I were an alien, I wouldn't want Earthlings out there because we don't have a good history. We're nasty. We're not nice guys here on Earth. And people look at me, what do you mean? I'm a nice guy. Yeah, but the planet is spending its resources for killing people more than it is for helping them, saving them, feeding the starving, feeding the poor. So there's a question. What are the others in the neighborhood doing? Are there rules of engagement? In other words, are there rules that you can't go bother somebody else? We don't have a planetary government. You stop to think about that, that is a little strange. We have, 195 countries, I think, the last time I checked. And there are people in power who love having power, running each country kind of thing. I get people saying, why don't they just land on the White House lawn? Well, it's a no-fly zone for one thing. That's apparently not why they're here. They know we know they're here. After you've been tracked on radar umpteen times, I've found information about a lot of good radar cases. So my role is to take advantage of my professional background as a nuclear physicist who's worked for a respectable companies like GE, GM, Westinghouse, etc., to educate people about the enormous amount of evidence that's out there and to raise the question, how do we want to behave? That's not a trivial question when we're building nuclear weapons all over the place. I'm a nuclear guy. I appreciate that in the sense of, my God, so much power in the hands of people who I wouldn't trust with that much power. There's a few countries now, everybody else is trying to get nuclear weapons to exert their power on their neighbors. This is a mess. I don't want my great-grandson to grow up in a world that is still doing the same thing when he's an adult. We need to get our act together on this one. So that's one of the things that drives me. Yes, I enjoy being on the stage and so forth, but there's a bigger story here. And I wish I had access to the files of the aliens. How many civilizations make it once they've reached this point of developing nuclear weapons? Will everybody do that? Well, there's a key factor here. Every advancing civilization will want to know, how does its star produce its energy? An awful lot of energy there. And even though we on the planet were thinking that stars produce their energy by burning gas, this is back in the 1920s, less than 100 years ago. Now we know it's nuclear fusion. And the same fusion that can be used for bombs, H-bombs, can be used for a propulsion system. I worked on a study of fusion propulsion for deep space travel in 1962. And the conclusion was, if you want to spend the money, you can do it. It takes a lot of money. These programs aren't 4 professors and 8 grad students. We're talking about thousands of people work on these programs. But we have choices to make. What kind of world do we want in 50 years, let's say? Still scrabbling with each other? More countries trying to build nuclear weapons? The only use for a nuclear weapon is to kill. Nuclear propulsion is another story. And, you know, the Navy learned this a long time ago. The United States Navy has not only submarines that can go around the world underwater, nuclear-powered submarines. In the First World War, or Second World War even, German submarines could stay underwater for a day. Diesel engines, they need air. You can't keep them under the water. Now, you go around the world literally underwater without coming to the surface. That's since 1960. It makes a big difference. It means you don't know where my submarines are. You attack me, I can attack you without your being able to stop it. The nuclear Navy has nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Operate for 18 years. 18 years without refueling. That's rather incredible. If you're a ship captain, that makes one heck of a lot of difference if you don't need to have a tanker or 2 or 3 or 4 circling around. So it forces one to think about these things. What can we do to make the world a better place for our great-grandchildren? I think of that because I have a great-grandson. And I'm concerned. What are the chances of getting through this time of great tension? Right now, as we speak, there are Cold War battles going on, so to speak, battles of words. But those could easily lead to battles of weapons. And that concerns me. So we need to consider our place in the scheme of things. Flying saucers give us so much evidence from all over the planet. I said I've spoken in 19 countries. Everywhere people are interested. And sightings occur everywhere. It's not an occasional this country, that country. It's everywhere. When I check my audiences at the end of my lectures like Flying Saucers Are Real, or A New View of the Cosmos, or the Roswell Incident, and stuff like that. At the end of the lecture, I ask, how many people here believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? I've defined my terms earlier. Just raise your hand and I'll point and count. No names. Typically, it's 10%. I've had crowds as big as 2,000, so that's a lot of people. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. If there's anybody left, I'll say, how many of you were in the military at the time? If there's still somebody left, want to tell us about it? Get some interesting answers. One guy says, they took my pictures. Tell me more. I'm sure the audience would like to hear the rest of the story, I said. So he remained seated, gave him a microphone. He was piloting a 4-engine Air Force plane across the Pacific. And there was a radio message from the plane 20 miles ahead of them that there was a saucer heading their way. They had gun cameras on the plane, so they took pictures. They called the base to which they were going, and when they landed, the film was taken. They don't go to the drugstore with the pictures. And they were debriefed and told never to say anything. I had another guy say, "I'll talk to you later." He was in Vietnam flying a helicopter in the late 60s. And suddenly this sleek saucer-shaped vehicle comes upon them, circles around them twice, and he figured they were going to be dead in a minute, a new Russian vehicle. And it circled around them a couple of times and then took off. He reported it because you're supposed to report any new weapon system when you're in a war situation. This is Vietnam, after all. The next day, the base commander came to him and said, "Lieutenant Jones, you didn't see anything strange yesterday, did you?" "Yes, sir, I reported it." "You didn't hear me, Lieutenant Jones. You didn't see anything strange yesterday, did you?" "No, sir." I mean, you get enough stories like this and you get a picture of what's going on. The clamp is down pretty tight, especially for military guys. But the difference that makes is that it's the military, the government, that owns the sophisticated equipment, the radar systems, ground-based, the radar systems, airborne-based, space-based. So they have the control of that data. That doesn't go in the newspaper. It's classified information. So I'm very concerned, would love to see the files. What percentage of societies that reach this point, the potential for going to the stars, get through that time, because it's also the potential for developing big weapons. Fusion is fusion, whether you're using it for a weapon or for a propulsion system. So we need, there have only been a little bit more than a dozen PhD theses done about UFOs. There's room for plenty more. And I don't want everything out on the table because there are real security implications of technical data that anybody could use to build better weapons, propulsion systems, etc. But I think we need to start looking at ourselves in a new way. We're not alone. We are not behaving very well from an outsider's viewpoint. I wish I had the gift to see us as others see us, somebody once said. So I have felt privileged to be in the center of this maelstrom of discussions, of activities all around the world. I don't get to travel a lot too, but it's exciting, it's stimulating, it's mentally alerting. You've got a responsibility here. If you know something that would help people think of themselves as earthlings, that would be progress. Ufology is in sort of a mixed bag situation. UFOM is quite active. It's the largest of the civilian groups. It's got a few thousand members now. It receives between 500 and 1,000 reports a month, but it doesn't have funding for a lot of scientific investigations. I heard today discussions about electromagnetic effects associated with UFOs and electric fields and what's going on here, high tech. Secondly, I think it's time for the media to do their job. There isn't a lot of good media coverage of the subject where you look carefully at the facts and the data and you go out to find out more information to back up what you started out with. We need to kick that up. More courses. There have been college courses taught about UFOs. And I've even taught at a couple of campuses, lectured at a couple of the campuses where these courses were taught. But we need a wider vision. There are some religious implications here. Some fundamentalists insist that all the sensible beings in the neighborhood are here on planet Earth. That the UFO stuff is the work of the devil, they say. I think there are implications, and there's a whole book, an excellent book by Dr. Barry Downing, The Bible and Flying Saucers, going back through the Old and New Testaments. And there are UFO cases all over the place. That helps explain some of what's gone on. And so there's a lot of work to be done to move forward in a new direction, to gather more evidence, to get people aware of the evidence that we do have. So that's part of what I try to do, is to get people excited about, hey, maybe we can find out some more. And what you find, incidentally, is that some of the best cases are the ones that aren't reported. The former military guys and stuff like that, because they're afraid of running afoul of security and being punished. Penalties for breaking security are stiff, long imprisonment, high fines, stuff like that. These guys are going to shut up unless there's a special situation in which they're willing to talk. So ufology is not in a great state. On the other hand, it's better than it was. If you look at meetings like this one here, there's some good papers by some good people presenting solid information. The MUFON conferences often have that. And so we're moving in the right direction, but we got a long way to go. I think within the next 10 years or so, there'll be some serious positive developments, partly because our attitude about life in outer space has changed. You're no longer thought of as some kind of a nut if you think there's life out there. It's pretty widespread. And what I hear very often is, surely we're not the only ones. God would not do that. It's kind of the attitude. And that's a good thing. Now, there's an old saying that new ideas come to be accepted, not because their opponents come to believe in them, but because their opponents die and a new generation grows up that's accustomed to them. So I think that's happening with UFOs. And I'm glad. Well, I'd like to say that we need to spend some time thinking about what does it mean to us, me, my family, my greater family, that we're not alone in the universe. What will it mean for my great-grandson? What can we do to make the world a better place in which our efforts can be spent to improve instead of to kill? This sounds like a stupid question. Well, of course it's more important to improve than it is to kill. We haven't been acting that way. Just look at the budgets for all the countries on this planet. So I'm still an optimist. I mean, I'm going to be 83 in my next birthday, and I'm still hopeful that man will learn to do better, to be concerned about the larger picture of where we fit in the scheme of things, and to get rid of our big ego about we're it. Whatever we do is the only important thing that can be done. I'm sorry, I don't buy that for a minute.